In case you didn't read the warning in the beginning, I'll let you know right now that this is my opinion. Secondly, and this is very important, listen to everything I have to say from the beginning to end. So my sister sent me this one article which came from a Swedish news website, and I thought I would discuss about it and later explain as to why I disagree with the bad image it's trying to give video games. So in a way you could say this is part 2 of my "Are video games the violence spawner?" rant. I will also discuss on things like with humanity's past and why things are not as they seem, at least not always, even though media likes to give us the illusion that it does. So please watch through that entire video if you haven't already before watching this one. Otherwise, you're missing out on a lot of important points I made in part 1 of this big rant. Anyways, let's investigate the article and what it said. So there's this male kid who taught a female kid in the game GTA 5 how to have sex in the game, go to strip clubs, and murder with an axe. Followed by the fact that in this article they also mentioned how kids plays GTA 5 with each other in the school area and pretends that they are actually playing the game. I think it's safe to say that this is not part of a dark mindset in life, but it rather connects with the game addiction. When I was little, I used to pretend being Rayman with my friends, and we pretended that we were quote-unquote playing Rayman free, as silly as that may sound. It's just something kids does, likes to pretend being part of a world that is fictional. This does not give them violent practice per se for my concern, as at the end of the day, they are just playing. It should be no different from chasing after one another in a light-hearted and kid-friendly way. Literally everything that kids plays around with each other on is for the majority of the time light-hearted and kid-friendly. It might have a dark path behind its principle, like chasing each other could give the impression of pretending to be a serial killer, but kids does not usually think that deep into it. Some kids, however, goes to the extreme and kills cats with one another, but I'll get to that later. Take chess, for example. The purpose behind it is very dark and grim. You literally kill people and are in the middle of a war of some sort. But the way the game was made makes it rather lighthearted and more friendly, even to kids. Take the Flappy Bird story, for example, where a brother killed his own brother because he beat his high score on Flappy Bird. Flappy Bird is a cartoon-like game. It has no violence in it, but it is designed in a very frustrating way. And trust me, I do find that game to be incredibly stupid. Because when we look at the game's art direction, it's very cartoon-like. So where did this all-sudden violence come from? Well, think about it. Is it not possible for stuff like this to happen in real life as well, with a real-life competition? For example, there are plenty of people that literally takes any competition in real life personal, and they decide to get pissed when they lose. So saying this only came from Flappy Bird cannot be true. It's a problem the person was already having before playing Flappy Bird. The problem of controlling his anger when he gets pissed over losing on something. It's not the game itself that did this effect, because if that was the case, people would more often murder each other because of frustrating games like Flappy Bird. It's a matter of that this guy approached the game in a more personal matter. In other words, in the wrong mindset. Not being able to handle losing at games is closely associated with low self-esteem, which seemed to confirm a flaw in your personality. Losing a game seemed to say something about yourself, usually something negative, against which you have no defenses. But a low self-esteem is not always what it seems. It is often the result of a biological flaw preventing you to feel good about yourself. Again, you cannot say it's the game that did this automatically. Because if that was the case, very much everyone would murder each other by this point. The connection with having a low self-esteem can have been caused by many sorts of reasons. Either he was having family problems, maybe he did not succeed in life as much as his brother did, so he did this to seek for revenge, not doing well in school, having too much stress in life, feeling weak or ugly in comparison to others. I'd be here forever if I mentioned all the sorts of possibilities which could cause this, but I think I got the gist of it by this point. Well, almost. But I will get to this later by the end of this video. Or at least close to the end. So bear with me here, I'm not done. Now, let's look at Daniel Patrick's case, where he murdered both his parents because they were stopping him from playing more violent video games. His dad told him there would be no more violent games, and that is what caused this frustration and anger inside Daniel to spawn. I would know this because he said this in an interview. He stated that he was used to shooting on people because of the video games, and that the games taught him the mindsets of that eventually his targets would respawn regardless. And when he was being asked if he would blame on the video games, he admitted that he takes his own responsibility for what he did, and does not blame at the video games at all. Now, it's kinda important to remember that, because that will connect to my final conclusion on this. When he stated that he thought his parents would respawn, I'd blame that on that he was far too addicted to the games to a point where he could not tell reality and the virtual world apart. And this is often, if not always, due to bad parenting. The game from my concern was at least 18 plus, yet he got to play it from his parents. So obviously, the blame goes on the parents for ignoring the warning, not thinking through and just giving their kid, of which was at the time a teenager, an 18 plus game. Saying something like violent games causes more violence and is a problem is an opinion and not factual, because the negative effect does not apply to everyone. Trust me, this will all make sense by the end, so keep bearing with me here. Going back in the Stone Age, we human beings used violence. When we were hunting for animals, we very much killed them off so that they would bleed thereafter, and eventually we would eat their meat. We needed to do that because it was part of our survival. We did violence for our own reasoning and will to survive. Just like you often play as the good guy in video games and defend yourself from the bad guys. I know there are some jackasses of which will state that animal hunting does not count for whatever stupid reason, but the easy principle is that we used violence towards a creature that has life. In other words, a life form, of which we technically speaking still do nowadays without paying attention, and even though we really don't need meat anymore to survive. Violence is violence, regardless of which creature or life form you give harm. But in a time like this, there is less need for people to use violence towards animals, because machines very much does the job for us by this point. Now it's more common with violence via bank robbery, really any kind of robbery in general, murdering someone, and so on. If anything, I'd say both violent games and regular games has had a more positive effect in our society. Games makes us able to memorize better and get better reflexes. We become more brave and stronger once we have got used to seeing guns, knives, and violent people. And there are some games that helps doctors who takes parts of operations to practice with a game that allows you to be able to be aware of your surrounding and every move you take and how it affects the other things around it, while not paying far too much attention at one spot, because if you do that, it will turn pretty ugly. It seems that violent games gets the blame for violence, unlike violent movies, violent cartoons, and so on, because it contains interactivity, because you can control the objects themselves in the virtual world. And therefore, according to many, games is a murder simulator. And if you're calling games a murder simulator, you have my pleasure of calling you a retard. What about paintball and laser tag? In those two examples, you're holding objects from real life and not from a virtual world. Yet we see people blame at violent video games and not those two, which further proves my point that there's a difference between holding a gun and holding a controller. Just because the game contains interactivity doesn't make it a murder simulator. And again, with those two examples I made, why the hell does those two not get the blame? They're not virtual, they are real. You're holding actual objects with those two examples. Literally, paintball is very popular culture. And why is media not putting blame on it? Well, that further proves another point I made in part 1 of this topic. So I'll go back to it, in case you forgot. Media likes to bring up violent video games because it's a very hot topic that gets much attention. Because like I said in part 1, media would logically want video games to go away. Because when you're playing video games, you're not watching the TV. So the TV network gets unwatched. In other words, they don't get paid. So of course the TV network would want video games to go away. Like when on Channel Fox, they were blaming on PSP because it can bring you porn out of thin air. When in reality, any device with wireless connection can do that. Like, I don't know, mobile devices. Beavis and Butthead is a very disturbing and sometimes violent cartoon. There were some kid that fired up a firecracker on a cat's butt and killed it. And the kid said that he did it because Beavis and Butthead did it in an episode. When if anything, the kid probably never even watched that episode, but thought of it by its own. Yeah, that was literally the kid's defense. Notice how I went from violent video games to mentioning things like violent cartoons, violent movies, and rock and roll, to name a few examples. That is because when something terrible happens, people find an escape pod to find something to blame at. Don't you think a society like now with psychologists would blame on the criminals instead of finding an escape pod? Yes, there are psychologist tests that says that violent video games drives aggression, but for every test that applies that it's being true, there's another that says it doesn't, of which further proves my point I made in part 1 of this rant, that there are the ones that gets affected by the games who had no common sense, and then there are the ones that has common sense and does not get affected in a negative manner. More on that later though. Now, let's look at the high school shooting. Eric Harris and Dylan who caused the shooting action and later flat out suicide. I'll dig deeper with the shovel, so stick with me here. Harris made a site where he hosted his own Doom levels that he hosted. But then Harris made a blog where he would joke about parents in the school and how he would later graduate and make stuff like explosives. Then his aggressive side of the society expanded. Dylan shared the website address to a kid, and the mother to that kid put numerous complaints towards Harris, thinking he was dangerous, and rightfully so. Eventually, Harris would talk to a psychologist about depression, being angry, and having suicidal thoughts. Harris described the two different antidepressants he had, both of which had a side effect of increased aggression, loss of remorse, and mania. And directly after, when media came into the game, they decided to directly put the blame on video games and bullying. And just like I said in my part 1 of this rant, this has to do with bad parenting, where the parents did not react even though their kid was physically ill and in this case suffered from things like mania. Still don't believe me? Let's take this other example then. There was the Virginia shooting, when a reporter literally got shot in front of the camera, caused by, I don't know how to spell out his name, so I'll just call him Ko, or Cho. In middle school he was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, known as selective mutation. Sorry if I spelled out either of these incorrect. And thereafter video games were quickly blamed, even though his roommates made it clear that he did not even play any video games. I think media still drew the conclusion that he played video games because of the stereotype that he was having game addiction problem. I'd rather not bring up these monsters of people, but it seems that if I did not, my points would not be nearly as valid. There are some examples, or more examples at that, I could mention to further prove my point with all of this, but I think I got the gist of it. My point is that these people were obviously physically ill. They, in other words, needed help, and people around them noticed it. Yet, they did not take action to get these people the help they needed. Some people are just either born mentally ill or they become that way. All these awful things that I mentioned could have been prevented from happening if a parent, friend, or an adult, to mention some examples, took actions and got those people the help they obviously so desperately needed. If there's an issue that needs to be solved, then going on the witch hunt bandwagon instead of actually investigating the problem is going to be much less effective. Because if people keeps going to these silly escape pods just to find something to blame on, we won't be able to prevent these things from happening in the future. It's that simple. If what you're doing does not seem to help, and you seem to have been trying to help your kid in every way possible, then trying to forget about it and stop trying to solve the problem won't let the problem go. And if anything, it should give you that ignoring the problem is going to make things turn more ugly in the future signal instead. So if you have one of those rare and extreme cases, take your kid to a psychologist that works for criminals. As extreme as that may sound, it may work. Sometimes you just gotta solve things the extreme way. At the end of the day, a solution is a solution, and in cases like these, solutions is far better option than finding an escape pod to jump on the bandwagon, and if anything, is just wasting people's times and energy with no proper results. You cannot say that violent games causes violent crime or action because only in about one of my examples someone played a violent video game. But yet, it was violence. Let me give you an example of why it's not the video games itself that caused it. Scene 1. Someone plays a violent video game to go out and kill someone. Scene 2. Someone does not get its service on its mobile device, so it decides to take someone down in a fight by the frustration it's getting. It's the same principle. One person kills the other. Only violent video games gets the blame for it, and not the cell phone coverage, TV coverage, or computer coverage. Really, saying violent video games drives violence cannot be said out loud that easily. At least when you think about it, because there are far too many factors to make it to be driven that way. Yes, there are psychologists that does cover this subject great, but the moment you have tests being funded by people that has no concern about the scientific process but wants a sign of what you were already believing in is true, and just that alone, things get skewed. This is called confirmation bias, where someone has found a conclusion and does research to find anything that can support their claim. But we all know how it goes. Media will still put the blame on violent video games from time to time just to find an escape pod and let that take the blame for it. It does not happen as often as it used to, but it will still happen from time to time. And trust me, it still is. I said it before and I'll say it again. There's a lot of factors that has caused someone to do a violent or brutal thing. It all depends on a lot of factors. The person was either having to have gone through some mental illness of some sort, or been driven away from its home. How someone was raised poorly as he or she had grown up, how society has affected them in their life, or someone could have just had a really bad day. And once the person snaps, people panic and gets ready to put the blame on video games for an escape pod. And if that person played games, the games will probably take the blame, as it's an easy target. However, what you can say is that all these crimes were made from people by mental instability, because these people clearly had mental illness instability and were having the wrong state of mind on things. Take the guy who made the Norway bombing, for example. He felt and still feels that the thing he did was the right thing to do. That is clearly psychotic, and his reasoning for doing it is pure insanity. Through all these examples, it was mental illness that caused this, and that is what is needed to be prevented, not some silly shining objects that often gets the blame because people just likes to find an escape pod. If anything, politics discussions gives more violent effect than something like violent video games. Saying someone did something because it happened in a game is very stupid to say when said out loud. Not only that, but also when you say it out loud, you look like a damn idiot for everyone around you. At least the ones that uses common sense you will look stupid for. And while I do believe the phrase that violence is part of the human nature's past, when it comes to survival and self-defense, in a time like this, violence is not really needed. Any people with common sense would not use violence in a time like this. We have phones, smartphones, computers and such, which can give us entertainment out of thin air. If anything, we have become rather calm and lazy. Again, for the 100th time, at the end of the day, the person who did something brutal or violent did it in its own will. Why that is so hard to predict? Again, I honestly have no idea.